If you're a man over 60 and you already have a girlfriend, this is not going to sound like the videos you've seen before, and that's exactly the point. It's not about losing money. It's not about an obvious red flag you somehow missed. It's not even about her being difficult, controlling, or wrong for you in any dramatic way. Most men in a stable relationship after 60 make one quiet mistake that has nothing to do with who she is and everything to do with what they slowly stop doing once the relationship starts feeling safe. It doesn't look like a mistake while it's happening. It looks like being a good partner. It looks like keeping the peace, and that's exactly why almost nobody catches it until years have already passed, and something inside them feels quietly different than it used to. Stay with me until the end, because the moment I describe how this actually shows up day to day, you're going to recognize it immediately, and you may realize it's already been happening in your own relationship for longer than you think. Most videos about relationships after 60 are aimed at men who are still single, still deciding whether to open the door to a relationship at all. That's an important conversation, but it skips over an entire group of men who already made that choice, who are already in something stable, and who assume, understandably, that the hard part is behind them now that the relationship exists. What almost nobody tells those men is that a different, quieter risk begins exactly at that point, one that has nothing to do with choosing the wrong partner and everything to do with what happens gradually inside a relationship that already feels safe and settled. Let's start with why this specific stage of a relationship is more dangerous than the beginning, because most men assume the opposite is true. When you're dating someone new, you're naturally cautious. You notice things. You pay attention to how she treats people, how she handles disagreement, whether she respects your time and your independence. That awareness protects you. But once the relationship becomes stable, once she's officially your girlfriend and the uncertainty of early dating disappears, something shifts. The vigilance that used to protect your peace relaxes because it feels like the hard part is over. This is Nathan, and today we're talking about the mistake that happens specifically after that relaxation sets in. The one almost no man notices because it doesn't feel like danger, it feels like comfort. Here is the mistake, stated plainly. Once a man over 60 has a stable girlfriend, he gradually starts trading his own preferences for her comfort, quietly, one small decision at a time, believing that keeping things peaceful requires him to stop voicing what he actually wants. He tells himself this is maturity, that he's past the age of unnecessary arguments, that a good relationship means not sweating the small stuff. What he doesn't realize is that he isn't choosing peace. He's choosing silence, and those are not the same thing at all. Picture two versions of the same man facing the identical situation. She suggests spending Sunday visiting her sister again, the third weekend in a row, when he had quietly been hoping for a quiet morning at home or time with his own friends instead. The first version of him says nothing, smiles and goes along with it, telling himself it isn't worth mentioning. The second version says, warmly and without tension, that he'd love to join her, but would also really enjoy having Sunday morning to himself first, and suggests joining her in the afternoon instead. Nothing about the second response is confrontational. It simply exists, out loud, instead of disappearing silently the way it did for the first man. Multiply that single moment by hundreds of similar ones across a year, and the difference between these two men becomes the difference between a relationship built on two real people and one quietly built around only one. Here's how this actually looks in daily life, because it rarely looks like sacrifice while it's happening. It looks like agreeing to spend the weekend the way she wants again, without mentioning that you had something else in mind, because bringing it up feels like more effort than it's worth. It looks like going along with a spending decision that quietly bothers you, because raising it feels like starting an argument over something that seems small in the moment. It looks like skipping time with an old friend because she seemed a little uneasy about it last time, and it was simply easier to stay home than to explain yourself. None of these moments feel significant individually. That's exactly the problem. Each one is small enough to justify away, and that's precisely what makes the pattern so easy to miss until it's already deeply established. It also looks like laughing along with a comment that actually stung a little, rather than gently saying it landed wrong. It looks like agreeing that a certain habit of yours is silly or outdated when she mentions it, even though it genuinely matters to you, simply because defending it feels disproportionate to the moment. It looks like slowly stopping certain small routines, a hobby, a regular phone call with an old friend, a particular way you like to spend a Saturday morning, not because she demanded it, but because it quietly became easier to let them fade than to keep explaining why they mattered. Individually, every one of these looks like nothing. Together, over years, they add up to a man who has quietly become smaller inside his own life, one reasonable-sounding accommodation at a time. The reason this happens specifically after 60 is worth understanding, because it isn't really about her at all, it's about where you are in your own life. By this age, most men have already spent decades in situations that required conflict, negotiation and compromise, careers, marriages, raising children, managing responsibilities they didn't always choose. When a stable, affectionate relationship finally arrives later in life, it can feel like a reward, a place where you finally get to stop fighting for things. That feeling is completely understandable, and it's also exactly what makes a man vulnerable to trading his own voice for the comfort of not having to use it anymore. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that builds across a lifetime of necessary conflict, the kind that comes from negotiating with employers, resolving disputes with family, managing the countless small disagreements that come with raising children or running a household for decades. By the time a man reaches his 60s, the idea of one more argument, even a small healthy one, can feel disproportionately heavy, simply because he has already had so many of them across his life. This is exactly why silence starts to feel like relief rather than what it actually is, a slow withdrawal from having a say in his own daily life. There's also something quieter happening underneath this, something many men don't want to admit, even to themselves. After retirement, after the loss of a spouse, after years of an empty house or long evenings alone, having someone who wants your company again can feel like more than companionship. It can feel like relief from a kind of loneliness that had started to feel permanent. When that's the case, a man often becomes so grateful for her presence that he stops evaluating whether the relationship is actually working the way it should, and starts focusing entirely on making sure nothing disrupts it, even at his own expense. This gratitude is not something to be ashamed of, and it usually comes from a genuinely good place. But gratitude and self-erasure can start to blend together without a man noticing the line between them. Being grateful that someone wants to spend their life with you is healthy. Believing that you therefore owe her your silence on everything that matters to you is not the same thing, even though it can feel that way in the moment. Many men conflate the two simply because both feelings arrive together, wrapped in the same relief of no longer being alone. Here's the part that most men never realize until much later. This pattern doesn't actually protect the relationship. It slowly damages it in a direction most men don't expect. When a man consistently goes silent instead of voicing what he actually wants, something happens that feels backwards at first. His girlfriend doesn't necessarily become more attached to him because he's easy to be around. Over time, she often, without consciously deciding to, begins to respect him slightly less because a man with no real preferences, no real friction, no visible sense of his own needs starts to feel less like a partner and more like someone who simply agrees. Attention and affection can survive this for a while. Respect usually doesn't. This is the trap hiding underneath the whole pattern. The very behavior a man adopts to protect the relationship is often the thing quietly eroding it from the inside, and because it happens gradually, by the time the effects become visible, most men have no idea where things started going wrong. They only know that something feels different than it used to, without being able to name exactly what changed. This shows up in small, easy-to-miss moments. A woman who once asked his opinion on everything gradually stops asking, not out of malice, but because she's absorbed, without consciously deciding that he doesn't really have opinions of his own anymore, or doesn't feel like sharing them. Decisions that once felt shared start feeling like hers alone to make, simply because he stopped participating in shaping them. He may even feel a quiet resentment building without connecting it to the years of silence that created the very dynamic he now finds himself unhappy with. There's also a physical cost to this that rarely gets talked about, and it matters more after 60 than it did earlier in life. Silently absorbing frustration instead of expressing it doesn't make the frustration disappear. It just relocates it inward. A body that no longer recovers from stress as quickly as it once did ends up carrying tension that never gets released because it was never voiced in the first place. Sleep gets a little worse. Patience gets a little thinner. A general sense of low-grade tension becomes background noise a man stops even noticing. Because he's grown so used to it, he assumes it's just what getting older feels like. It isn't. Often, it's simply the accumulated cost of years spent staying quiet to avoid friction that could have been resolved in a 2-minute conversation. This connects to something many men don't expect, which is that the physical symptoms of unspoken frustration often get misattributed entirely. A man notices he's more tired than he used to be, or that small things irritate him more easily, and he assumes it's simply age catching up with him. Sometimes that's true. But often, what's actually happening is a slow accumulation of unresolved friction, dozens of small moments where something bothered him and he chose silence instead of a brief, honest conversation. None of those moments disappear just because they went unspoken. They accumulate somewhere, and for many men, that somewhere becomes physical tension, disrupted sleep, or a general shortness of patience that seems to have no obvious cause. So what does the correction actually look like? Because this isn't about becoming difficult or picking fights over things that don't matter. It starts with distinguishing between genuine flexibility, which is healthy, and silent self-erasure, which isn't. Flexibility means choosing not to make an issue out of something because it truly doesn't matter to you. Self-erasure means staying quiet about something that does matter, purely to avoid discomfort. The first is generosity. The second is a slow withdrawal from your own life, one small silence at a time. Practically, this means voicing preferences early and calmly, before they build into resentment. If a weekend plan doesn't work for you, saying so simply without turning it into a confrontation is not the same as picking a fight. It's giving her the chance to actually know you, instead of a version of you that has quietly agreed to everything for the sake of ease. It also means protecting the parts of your life that existed before this relationship began, the friendships, the routines, the interests that make you who you are. A woman who genuinely respects you will not be threatened by those things continuing. If maintaining them consistently causes friction, that's information worth paying attention to, not a reason to quietly let them go. If you don't know where to start, the simplest entry point is noticing, just for 1 week, every time you feel the small internal flicker of disagreement and choose to say nothing about it. You don't have to act on all of them immediately. Simply noticing how often it happens is often eye-opening on its own, because most men underestimate how frequently this pattern shows up once they actually start paying attention to their own reactions instead of moving past them automatically. From there, pick the smallest, lowest stakes moment to practice speaking up, not the biggest one. Building this muscle works the same way any other skill does, starting small and building consistency rather than saving it for the one conversation that feels too important to risk. It also means getting comfortable with the fact that healthy disagreement is not the opposite of peace. It's often what actually protects it long term. A relationship where one person never expresses a genuine preference isn't peaceful, it's just quiet. And quiet is not the same thing as stable. Real peace comes from two people who trust that disagreement won't threaten the relationship, not from one person who has simply stopped bringing anything up. Consider what actually happens when a man starts practicing this correction consistently over a few months. The first few times he voices a preference after a long pattern of silence, it might feel unfamiliar, even slightly uncomfortable, both for him and for her. That discomfort is not a sign that something is going wrong. It's simply the natural friction of a dynamic recalibrating itself back toward balance. Most women, especially ones who genuinely care about the man they're with, respond well to this shift once they see it isn't hostility. It's simply him showing up more fully as himself. What felt risky in the first few conversations usually becomes the new normal within a relatively short period of time, and the relationship that results tends to feel sturdier, not more fragile, than the one built on years of accumulated silence. It's worth pausing here to address an honest question some men watching this might have, which is how this differs from simply being in a relationship with someone controlling or difficult. It's a fair distinction to make because the two can look similar from a distance but come from very different places. A controlling partner actively discourages a man's independence, reacts with anger or punishment when he expresses a preference, or makes clear that disagreement carries a cost. What we've been describing today is different and in some ways harder to catch because it isn't being imposed on him by her at all. It's a pattern he's built himself, often with a partner who would likely welcome more of his input if he offered it. That distinction matters because the solution is completely different. If you're dealing with active control, that's a separate conversation entirely. If you're dealing with the quiet self-erasure we've covered today, the fix isn't leaving the relationship, it's simply starting to show up inside it as the full version of yourself again. Here's what I want you to take from all of this. Fixing this pattern doesn't put your relationship at risk. It's usually what saves it. A woman who has been quietly losing respect for a man who never voices anything of his own often responds, somewhat surprisingly to him, with more warmth once he starts showing up as an actual person with real preferences again, not less. The fear that speaking up will create conflict is usually far larger than the reality of what actually happens when a man finally does it calmly and consistently over time. It's worth being honest that this shift can feel strange at first, even for the man making it. After years of automatically deferring, choosing to voice a preference can feel almost unnatural, like relearning a muscle that atrophied from disuse. That discomfort fades quickly with practice, but it's worth naming so you don't mistake early awkwardness for evidence that the correction isn't working. Most men who commit to this shift report the same experience, that the first few conversations feel harder than expected, and within a short time it starts feeling like simply being themselves again, rather than something they have to consciously manage. So here's the real takeaway. The mistake we've covered today was never about her. It was about a quiet trade most men make without realizing it, exchanging their own voice for the comfort of avoiding friction and slowly losing something valuable in the process, their own presence inside the relationship they were trying to protect. There's one more thing worth understanding before we close because it changes how you might think about the timeline for fixing this. This shift isn't only about the relationship itself. A man who relearns how to voice his preferences calmly at home tends to find that same steadiness showing up elsewhere too, in conversations with adult children, in friendships that had quietly gone one-sided, even in how he handles minor frustrations in daily life that used to build up silently. The relationship is simply where this pattern usually gets noticed first, because it's the closest, most constant mirror a man has. But the correction, once it takes hold, tends to ripple outward into every part of life where he had quietly been trading his own voice for the comfort of avoiding friction. This is also why the correction is worth making even if your current relationship already feels reasonably good. The absence of obvious conflict is not the same as the presence of genuine balance. A relationship can look peaceful from the outside and even feel comfortable most days while still being quietly built on one person doing all the accommodating. Recognizing that now, before decades pass, is far easier than trying to unwind a much deeper pattern later, once resentment or physical stress has had years to accumulate underneath the surface. Before you go, think honestly about your own relationship right now. Is there something small you've been quietly going along with, something you haven't mentioned because it felt easier not to? Tell me what it is in the comments. I read everyone, and I'm genuinely curious how common this pattern actually is among the men watching this. And if this made you look at your own relationship a little differently, subscribe, because in the next video we're going deeper into exactly how a woman's respect for a man changes over time and the specific moments that either build it or quietly take it away.